Hello and welcome back to another Advancing Christian. My name is Scott Fisher, and today's sermon is Never Alone. You ever found yourself in a lonely position where you're like, does God ever see me? Does God ever know me? How do I feel so lonely? David felt the same way. And as we go about today in this sermon, we're going to be talking about how the cry of the lonely heart God hears. God hears your lonely heart. God hears your position for acceptance, for understanding. Why doesn't he hear my position? He does. He hears all positions. He knows all things. He is God. And so we're going to go read about this one time with David, and he cries out to God and reflects on the agony that he has, just like Christ reflects back on this same passage and goes over a similar thought process. In Psalms 22, verses 1, starting in 1. The title is, Why have you forsaken me? My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, and by night I find no rest. Verse 3. Yet you are holy, enthroned in the praises of Israel, in our fathers entrusted. They trusted you, and you delivered them. To you they cried, and you were rescued. In you they trusted, and were not put to shame. I'd like to pause here a moment in verses 1 through 5 and just think about how God answers prayers in moments. Sometimes he doesn't answer them with yes. Sometimes he doesn't answer them with no or even maybe. But God knows all things and accounts for all questions and has an answer for all things. Sometimes it's not the way we would expect it or the way we want it, but God has all the answers and knows all the right things to give his children. He's a gracious, good God who knows the right things at the right times. You experienced loneliness in your foreignness, where you felt lonely and rejected from God. But even Christ experienced these for the forsakenness on the cross and the redemption from our isolation. Let's take a look at Matthew 27. Matthew 27 takes a deeper look into the same verse where Jesus himself recounts the same verse again as going through this cross process, this redemption process for us, but then a sort of step back for him. He has to take that position of sinlessness and put the sin on himself in this isolated measure. And we look at the scripture, Matthew 27, verse 46. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land, and on the 9th hour, and about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. That is, God, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders hearing it said, This man is calling Elijah. And one of them once ran and took a sponge and filled it with sour wine and put it against his to drink. And the others waited to see whether Elijah would come to save him. But Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, a curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the whole was shook, and the rocks were split. Let's take a moment here to realize that Jesus has reinforced the scriptures. Yet again, he reinforces it again, bringing back that God, why, my God, have you forsaken me? Did God literally forsake Jesus on the cross? That's another theological matter you could go on for days with. But the truth becomes that we all feel this lonely position. We all feel foreign from God. We all feel isolated from God from time to time, or from situation to situation. And we all feel never alone. We all feel alone sometimes. We all feel like we're isolated from God at times. And we know that God holds all things according to His purpose and time, so that the yes may be yes, and the you know may be you know. And then maybe when we hold on and wait for a second, because there's a certain time for God to come around. And even David cried out for his loneliness to show him that he'd be honest before God. Can we all be honest before God? That is the truth behind it. Can we be honest? Can we be honest in our loneliness, that the painful human experiences that we arise in the crowded places just like as easily in our quiet solitudes? To be wise before God, none can be. But David the king, after his own heart, cried out in desperation, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Just as echoed before in Jesus, and he hung on the cross to learn what the agony was about. And as we have our own agonizing moments, and we think about what God has in that, and we think about what we have for God, and we think about those heavenly places like we talked about before in that last sermon, and we trust God. We know that our loneliness is not far away, but we know that the loneliness that we have is not so difficult anymore, because God takes our place, and God has all things according to His will. So how do we rejoice in our loneliness? How do we rejoice when we're alone? Because we know that God has all things according to His timing. Our loneliness may seem like a universal condition, all crying out like David. But even in our loneliness, we can be brought together and in community with one another, as we will talk about later. Jesus took our ultimate loneliness. And in Isaiah 53, in Isaiah 53, in Isaiah 53, 3 through 4, Jesus is quoted as a man of sorrows, understanding loneliness. See, the Old Testament reinforces the New Testament, and vice versa, and it goes back and forth. And Jesus quotes the Old Testament to reinforce what is to become, and what has come is fulfilled, just as Jesus had shown, and what was predicted before. So as we look towards Isaiah 53:3, we can see, and we can start from the beginning here at 1. How about that? Who has believed that He has heard from us? Who has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For He grew up before Him like a young plant, and like a root in the dry ground. He had no form of majesty that we should look at Him, and no beauty that we should desire Him. Yet He despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, that one whom men hide their faces, He was despised and esteemed not. And so we can imagine the difficulties that He went through on the cross, and what that looked like. We can imagine what that looks like in our own life, our own crosses. And He says to take up our own cross and follow Him. What does it look like for you, Christian? I suppose it looks like a couch moment. I suppose it looks like where your car broke down, you have to move forward somehow. Your bill didn't get paid somehow. Somehow that lost loved one just didn't come back around. Did God have His sights on that? Absolutely. I guarantee you that every single moment God has His sights on it. It might not be the way we expected it, might be the way we wanted it, But God has a yes, no, or maybe for every situation. And where He didn't seem to succeed in one area, God has a plan for other things. God brings all things according to His will and His timing. So count on that. And as we look towards Isaiah 53, we realize He was despised in sorrows and acquainted with grief just like we were, so we can be brought together with Him in that same moment. I mean, he was hiding his face and being despised and esteemed not. Have we not seen how, like, a loved one or someone that we loved or someone we were close to esteem us not? Have we come to a place where once that cherished friend you once had, you thought they could never leave me nor forsake me? But they're not God. They have no power over that. They're weak and subsidiary to sin. They have sin. And we all have fallen short of the glory of God in our sin. And we know that we are called to a greater purpose, to shed off the loneliness of our hearts and to trust God, that we know we're never alone. In Matthew 27, verse 46, it says, "And about that ninth hour he cried out with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, elama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me?" And so we think about those things. We think about what Jesus said and what that really means to this whole moment. He's a man of sorrows. He's been acquainted with sin. Though having no sin of himself, he understands what that looks like. He understands our positions. And so as it is in 2 Corinthians, later on in the Bible, we find out in 2 Corinthians what this really looks like. 2 Corinthians 5:21. This is Paul later talking about the same incidents. For our sake he made him to be sin, who knew no sin, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. Because we can have fellowship with him. And the separation that we once had with sin is no more, because we have it with him. And we can bring our sins to before God and say, this is where I'm at. This is what I'm doing. Can you see me? Can you lift me up from my position? Because we know we can't do it on our own. And we know we have to have God's help through all things. We can't walk this journey alone. But even God hears when we have a distant cry of a prayer. Even God hears all prayers and knows all things. So he can redeem us out of all circumstances, even our lowest of sins. For even Paul said he was the lowest of the sinners. But we know that could be far from the truth. He seemed like a very high scholar, and how could he make such a statement? But he persecuted Christians even then, and he turned around, and he turned back, and he saw God, and he made a difference. Some people forget the other side of Paul, but that's important too. In Hebrews 13, in In Hebrews 13:5, keep your life free from love of money. Be content with what you have, for he said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Going on to 6. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. For what can man do to me? See, we know that God never leaves us nor forsakes us. So how can we have a lonely heart? Are we not human? Have we not been in such a position? Have we not been the lonely man on the bench once or twice? Or we think our circumstances are just about ourselves. And that's the way it is sometimes, isn't it? We're human. Have you ever been in that moment when you're thinking to yourself, yeah, I remember that. I remember sitting on a bench, just me alone, and that's it. Feels like nobody else could care less what's going on around me. Nobody could care less what happens here, or my preaching or whatnot. Been there. But we know God holds all things according to his timing and his purpose. So even God hears. And if nobody comes to know God, that would be a shame, wouldn't it? So there's a point behind all things. God hears even when it seems distant. Psalms 22, 35. No, 3 through 5, yes. So Psalms 22, 3 through 5. Yet you are holy, enthroned. This goes beyond the God, why have you forsaken me? Now we're going a little bit into the future. So we said before in 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from me? The words of my groaning, oh my God, I cry by day, and you do not answer, and by night I find no rest. So we've heard 1 and 2 before, but now we're taking a highlight back, and we're thinking, wait, God never heard? Was I not alone? But God was with me. There's another man on the bench. There's another man duking it out right when you're in the lowest moment. There's another man carrying you up when you're struggling. And as it says, yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In our fathers entrusted you delivered them. You delivered them to you, and they cried and were rescued. And they trusted you, and they were not put to shame. Not put to shame. No matter what your circumstances are, you will not be put to shame because you trusted God. Because you trusted God. And there'll be one day when you're brought before God, and we'll talk about that later. And you'll be brought before God, and God will be like, you trusted. You made a steward of my grace. And we're waiting on that moment. We're waiting on a time when we can see God again. We can be like, and just be still. And God will be like, yeah, you trusted in that moment. You trusted in that moment. So bring your pain before God. Meditate on that suffering that brings us near. Sometimes it feels hard when we're alone. Sometimes it feels just terrible. Like, how are we going to get through this thing? God says, I hold all things. I can hold this too. Till next time, we'll be talking about being honest with our faith. Building up from our lament, but being honest. Being honest. Advancing Christian.